Well, good day to everyone joining us and welcome to today's X-Talks webinar. Today's talk is entitled Digital Health, Embracing Human-Centered Design to Create Impactful Digital Experiences. My name is Ryan Muse and I'll be your X-Talks host for today. Today's webinar will run for approximately 60 minutes, and this presentation includes a Q&A session with our speaker. Now, the webinar is designed to be interactive, and they work best when you're involved. So please feel free to submit your questions and comments for our speakers throughout the presentation using the questions chat box, and we'll try to attend to your questions during the Q&A session. This chat box is located in the control panel, which is on the right-hand side of your screen. And if you require any assistance along the way, you can contact me at any time by sending a message using the same chat panel. At this time, know that all participants are in listen-only mode, and please note that the event will be recorded and made available for streaming on xtalks.com. At this point, I'd like to thank Verinex, who developed the content for this presentation. With a fully integrated concept to commercialization solution, Verinex's design and engineering expertise sets them apart, providing you with visibility to development feasibility and opportunity along the way. Their expertise improves launch readiness and expedites the development of technology for regulatory and commercial success. They are ISO 13485 certified and FDA registered for medical technology product development. And with more than 30 years of experience and global reach into emerging markets, their design and engineering specialization will make them your medtech vision a reality. Now I would like to introduce our moderator for today's event. Brandon Bogdalek has worked with dozens of medical device, drug delivery, diagnostics, and digital health companies on outsourced innovation and commercialization projects. In his current position, he represents the product development and engineering (PDE) function from a marketing lens, helping tell stories from internal and external subject matter experts that provide value and promote new thinking. He holds a bachelor's degree in biology from the University of Minnesota. And Greg Silvesti is the Vice President of Digital Health and Innovation at Sage Therapeutics. In this role, Greg has built a new innovation function in the organization and is leading all digital health efforts across the organization from translation medicine into commercial, as well as leading new teams focused on web experience and strategy and consumer and customer experience. So now, without further ado, though, I'd like to hand the mic and presentation over to our moderator for today's discussion. Brandon, you may begin when you're ready.
Thank you, Ryan. And I'll just confirm, it looks like everybody can see my screen okay, which is great. So awesome. Well, thank you guys so much for taking the time today. I know everybody's got busy schedules, but it's really encouraging to see the folks that we have in the audience today joining us for this discussion around human-centered design. We also have an awesome expert in the room, and Greg Silvesti from Sage, who is going to join me in a fireside chat today. But before we get started with that, I'm just going to share a couple slides to set the stage for our dialogue today. So, as I said, good afternoon, guys. I'm very excited to have everybody here. Today's conversation is really going to be focused around how do we create digital experiences that patients really have come to love and trust and use on a daily and a regular basis. And so just a little bit of a quick background on me. My name is Brandon Bogdalek. I'm Vice President here at Verinex. I have a bachelor's degree in biology from the University of Minnesota, and I've spent the majority of my career so far helping medical device and pharmaceutical companies build digital solutions. Most of that has been focused on the digital application space, as well as AR, VR, and voice. Verinex, just to give you a little bit of a background on who we are, we're a global service provider to the medtech industry, which we categorize into 4 different segments. That's the medical device space, the drug delivery space, the diagnostic space, and the digital health space. We were founded as an organization in 2019, but our roots as a company date back as far as the 1970s. Verinex as an organization is the culmination of 12 different service providers coming together under a single umbrella to create a world-class, robust service to our clients. The work that we do and the services that we provide range from early stage research and strategy, UX, UI, and digital creation, all the way through commercial and lifecycle management. We're lucky that we get to work with some of the world's largest medical device and pharmaceutical companies. I'd also say that we're equally lucky in that we get to work with the growth stage companies who are really going to be pioneering what's coming next in the healthcare space. So namely startup companies and small mid-sized businesses. And so that brings us to digital health at Veranex. And simply put, our focus in this space is helping our clients and enabling our clients to harness the potential of digital health, accelerating their ability to improve outcomes and capture value. And it's really truly an interesting time to be in this space. And disruption is happening and has been happening in healthcare over the last 10 years. And so to use a kind of an interesting metaphor, if we think about the Model T that came out from Ford way back in the day in the early 1900s, the Model T got you from point A to point B. Consumers wanted that, and that was the expectation, right? I'm going to leave my house and I'm going to go somewhere, and I'm going to get there. Now the car industry has evolved entirely. Going from point A to point B, I think, and safely would be considered table stakes. Now technology like CarPlay, adaptive cruise control, heated seats, etc., is really what people expect as far as a car experience, and behavior is changing, and they expect that added value whenever you go into that purchase. We're in a similar transition in healthcare today. Improving patient outcomes and providing care to patients is always going to be our point A to point B. That's never going to change. However, with the emergence of digital health, patients now play a much larger role in how that therapy is delivered, and we know they value that control. And so one of the things that we want to keep in mind when we're bringing these new digital solutions to market is that we don't necessarily want to create digital for the sake of digital. Poorly designed digital experiences for the consumer can actually do the opposite. It can move them away from solutions and things entirely. Some people might say it's like pineapple on pizza, right? This doesn't belong here. It's awkward, right? And we certainly want to avoid that when we're bringing new digital solutions to market. And so now this concept of human-centered design has been around for ages, and it's widely adopted in a lot of different industries, specifically consumer-facing industries. However, our industry, we find we often overweigh the value of feasibility from a technological perspective, when we overvalue viability from a business perspective, and we undervalue desirability from a human perspective. And so what we want to have a conversation about today, and what Greg and I are going to jump into, is how do we create solutions that are at the center of this Venn diagram? How do we bring solutions to market that are not only feasible from a technology perspective, we need that, we need to make money off of this, but it also needs to be desirable. And we believe that those are the best solutions that we can bring to market. And so without further ado, Greg and I are going to jump into this conversation today. We hope it's valuable for you guys. Greg is an expert in this space. I've had the pleasure of working with him for many years, and he's truly a subject matter expert. So Ryan, if you don't mind, if you can pull the screen share down, and we will jump into the conversation here. So before I do that, what I'd like to do, Greg, is why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself to the audience? Tell us a little bit about your background, how you got into the pharmaceutical space, and then ultimately into digital health.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So really excited to be here. And like Brandon said, we've worked together, I don't know, too long for me to actually remember how long it's been at this point. But so again, Greg Silvesti, I'm the Vice President of Digital Health and Innovation here at Sage Therapeutics. I've been here for about 2 years now, building up all of our innovation capabilities from a digital perspective. But I've been in digital health in this space, as I tell people, before we called it digital health. It was really just business model innovation when I got my start doing this. And I've been lucky enough to work at med device companies, big pharma companies, and everything else in between, doing multiple roles, working on connected glucose meters, all sorts of connected products in between. And most recently, I was the head of digital health at AbbVie before I made the jump over to Sage. And beyond that, I do like pineapple on my pizza, so that's something we can maybe open up and debate that a little bit later in the conversation today as well.
Yeah, it's so funny because the audience is always split on that comment. Sometimes I get laughs, sometimes I get people who are offended. So, you run the risk a little bit. But I appreciate you sharing a little bit about your background. What Greg didn't share is he's been a mentor to me and many of the people inside the organization as far as the right way to do digital innovation inside of an organization. We've been lucky enough to work with him It's just a real pleasure every time we get to partner on something. So I really appreciate you being here. So let's pivot a little bit and jump into the subject matter expertise. I want to make sure we deliver as much value for the audience as we can. So, the focus of our conversation today is really on the role that digital plays within the pharmaceutical industry. And I think how the value of digital has really evolved over, call it, the last 5 to 10 years. Given your background and what you've seen, the different organizations that you've worked in, can you maybe speak to how you've seen this evolution happen over time? I'd be curious, even in some of your first days when you're calling it business model innovation, right? What did digital mean then as far as value compared to where you're at now with Sage and the role it plays inside your organization?
Yeah, for sure. I think it's changed a lot, and then in some regards, it's changed a little, and I think that's just natural with the way things have gone. But the thing that has changed the most, I would say, is that this whole idea of digital sort of being on the periphery, on the outside, being its own separate entity, has really changed, right? I think the reason for that is because if you start to take a step back, what isn't digital at this point, right? When you start to think about it, it's gone from everything being, as I said, on the outside and sort of a bit of a novelty in a way to really something that has moved front and center. And really, I think the reason for that and the place that digital plays, I think, is in multiple areas. I think the focus of the conversation today is on digital health. And so for context, so for the audience knows when I say digital health, because I know we all have different definitions, or you talk to 10 people, you're going to get 10 different ideas of what it is. When we're talking digital health just for today, when I say that to me means sensors, wearables, apps, IoT, connected devices that we're really leveraging to think about how we can improve patient outcomes, create better experiences, and things along those lines. So that's really the focus for today. But broadly from a pharma or just from a life sciences perspective, you can then take that idea of experiences, digital, and apply that into also what you're doing for potential customers, people that take your products, or healthcare professionals that are interested in your product or prescribing it. So that's when you start to get into ways when you create web experiences, when you start to think about omni-channel and orchestration of experiences, a lot of consumer elements that you really didn't see in life sciences before that are now coming more front and center in that regard. But I think kind of going all the way back to the digital health side, the reason why it's changed so much is I think people are realizing the role of pharma companies are different, right? And I think that's the challenge that I always mention is what does the company really do? Like if you think you are a pill company, as an example, that's one thing. But if you start thinking about yourself as an outcomes company, which I think a lot of organizations are now moving towards, that idea of being an outcomes company means you can compete on many different ways. That's a combination of molecules, it's digital interventions, it's technologies, it's experiences. And I think people are seeing that when you start to look at those things combined, or sometimes even individually, just from a digital or a tech perspective, that's really where you can extract a lot more value and really solve, frankly, a lot of problems that have existed in the space that we're still trying to figure out, but I think it just gets us closer to figuring those things out.
Yeah, that's a great point, right? I mean, I think we have seen the evolution of pharmaceutical companies who, to use your words, we're just a pill-based company, right? We bring a new medication to market, and we do that every 10 years when certain patents expire, et cetera. So now thinking about how do we go beyond, right? How do we go beyond? What are our beyond the pill strategies? And there's a lot of different ways that you can slice and dice that, but digital certainly is going to play a role in how we can continue to add value. You rattled off a list of different digital solutions in the last question. You're talking about things like sensors, mobile apps, connected devices, etc. Maybe tell us just let's just start with like sensors, for example. What are you seeing in that space? It's certainly a space we're interested in. How do we collect large amounts of data with patients over a period of time? And what do we do with that as far as decision making? Do you have any thoughts on sensors specifically? And I mean, maybe this parlays into big data and AI. I'm sure it does in many ways, but curious your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think I realized too, Brandon, there's one element of the previous question I probably didn't address, which was I said it changed a lot, which I think I talked a little bit about that. What I didn't address was the changing a little part. And so The part that has still not changed necessarily is the fascination with the new shiny object or the individual piece of technology, right? So again, I've been around long enough doing this where the idea of a wearable was like groundbreaking when you thought about putting that into a clinical study. And then we moved into 3D printing, and we moved into AR and VR and meta spaces and everything else. And I would argue now where we're very much focused on and people love to get into is generative AI, which we can have that conversation, but it's these focus on the individual technologies and trying to apply those specifically, I think, is an area that hasn't changed maybe as much. But to the point of where the value is, and I think that's where I want to keep the conversation is in the value. There's lots of areas when you start to look at healthcare, right? So I think just from a sensor perspective, I think fundamentally at the end of the day, and I think your slide did a really good job of it, is there's a lot of areas of disconnect right now within the healthcare system where we frankly don't know what's happening. And I think at the end of the day, what the sensing technology has us the ability to do is to be able to close those gaps, right? To be able to kind of shed light, shine light in the little corners of healthcare that we don't get a chance to see. While at the same time, I think the other really important part is providing us with objective data. And that's really, really important thing, because what's so frustrating to me still is that, you know, I've got better diagnostic and objective data about what's happening with my car than I do about what's happening with myself or, you know, people that we're talking to with, you know, to take our products and things like that. And so that's really where, let's just broadly say, sensors really come into the equation. So if you think about it from, let's go really, really early up front when we think about translational medicine, biomarkers and things like that. When you start to look at those things, particularly what's interesting to me is within mental health, there's really not a lot of good markers right now. And so the whole idea of being able to use sensors and kind of create new digital biomarkers and proxies and things like that is a huge opportunity area, I think, number one. And then you translate that into beyond just translational medicine, but into clinical research, right? So much of what we do, you know, gold measure scales, things like that, like, are they really, I know they're the standard, but when you start to really break them down and you think about how we're looking at endpoints and things like that with some of these scales, like, there's better ways to do it. And I think that's where the implementation of a lot of these sensors and whatnot are coming into it. I think beyond that too, just thinking about the challenges within clinical research, when you start talking about diversity, when you start talking about trying to get people from different socioeconomic backgrounds and expanding what you're doing from a clinical perspective, sensing technology and things like that really enable you to do those sorts of things. And then the part that is most interesting to me is then how do you bring these things forward into market, right? Because I think it's one thing where you start talking about internally, like, how do we optimize what we're doing from a development perspective, but then the whole idea of being able to combine these sorts of technologies, to actually combine them with drugs and molecules and things like that, to actually be able to give you those better outcomes, like, that to me is where a huge, huge benefit is. And again, the specific technology is going to depend on your specific use case, which I think comes down into a lot of what we're talking about with human-centered design. And so I think we can talk a little bit through that, but the tech is all going to be led by what are we solving for first.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And I think that your comments actually leads nicely into the next question I kind of had queued up. And you hinted at it with, like, what you're really interested in is what can we commercialize? Like, what can we actually bring to market that provides value? And I think there's a lot of conversation in this space happening right now about what could be possible. And to go back to my Venn diagram, right? Like, what's technologically feasible? Can we do it? That's one thing. Can we bring it to market is a total another thing. So I guess I would ask, you know, from what you've seen as an expert in the industry working inside these organizations, like, what do you think today are the most valuable use cases of digital that you've seen commercialized? And I want to keep this focused on what has actually been commercialized, because I think we can talk all day long about what the future looks like and what that might hold as far as generative AI. But what do you see today working very well in the marketplace?
Yeah, absolutely. I think so. To me, the biggest thing from a digital perspective is actually what we see in the diabetes space, right? Like, that's an area where you've seen just such an impact from digital health and connected devices and whatnot. Just because, for a couple of reasons. Number one, I think, and it solves some of the challenges, is that for standalone products, sometimes from a digital perspective, right? We get very hung up on an individual product by itself. But really where the magic sort of comes in is when you can actually create a product that actually enables a service model around it. Right? That's where you start getting people embedded within an ecosystem. That's where you start getting data that's getting fed into workflows and how treatments are happening and things like that. And frankly, in diabetes, it's kind of a tried and true area where you're seeing all of those things happening. So to me, that is probably one of the best examples, just because it is actually giving you all the things that you're really looking for, which is better outcomes. It's giving you integrations into service models. It's actually enabling better care. And so those are all really the key things that when I look at like what's successful from a commercial perspective is most important. And I think that's probably some of the areas too why you're seeing some of the standalone therapeutics and things like that struggling a little bit in terms of like commercial viability at the moment, the digital therapeutics, I mean. Is there a lot of challenges in that workflow integration and things like that at the moment?
So that's an interesting point. Like when I think about diabetes, I think about like I have family members who are on continuous loop solutions, right? And that feedback and how it's completely revolutionized their lifestyle and completely just turned. They went from a very analog way of delivering insulin to themselves to something that is beyond their wildest dreams as far as the management of that particular disease. But a lot of those. This is an interesting nuance here. A lot of those devices are in the medical device space, right? I mean, companies like AbbVie Abbott and Dexcom are coming to market with those. Like, what do you see as the pharmaceutical industry's influence on some of that, right? Because when I think of those products, I think med device, and I think med device digital. Unless you would challenge me on that thinking.
Well, I think you're talking about a medical device, but if you take the same sort of model, it's exactly what everybody's doing, right? So there's a drug element to it, right? So there's the same level of interest from companies that are not just managing the actual glucose meter itself, but on the drug side of it as well, right? You see a lot of studies where you're combining drug plus some of these devices, and you've looked at some of those combination products as well. So. And that's frankly what a lot of drug companies are also doing when you're looking at injectables, when you're looking at digital products as well. Because again, the way to think about it in my mind and why the example is a good one is it's the equivalent to me what's happened in that space of someone who's just simply trying to lose weight, right? So if you think about a scale, inherently no one is going to say this scale is differentiating for me because literally you stand on it and it gives you a number, right? So you're not going to pay a premium for that. You're not going to think about that doing anything for you. Pre-connected device digital health within the diabetes space, it was the same thing, right? You had a glucose meter that gave you a number, but you were like, okay, so what? Like it gave you nothing else. Where now what's happening within that space, it's allowing you to better manage medications, how you are actually taking drugs, things like that, and overall lifestyle. And so to your point, yes, it is a device, but it's helping you manage the overall condition. And part of that is also from a drug perspective. So it may not necessarily be directly that drug developer, but it's that same concept of data, which is being turned into something actionable, which kind of gets you into the whole AI conversation, which is then allowing you to better manage your condition through the combination of both drugs, lifestyle, and other things like that, which I think is where everyone's trying to get to.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And diabetes is one of those, those diseases that I think it's got a real human-centered element to it, right? I mean, just a lot of different diseases do, but diabetes in particular, I think, considering how much of a lifestyle change that is and an impact on patients, like things that are human-centered in nature and doing that research up front, getting in front of patients, really understanding that disease stays is super important. And so I think pivoting the conversation just a little bit, like I'd love to chat with you about the earlier stages of these innovations, right? And when you're thinking about bringing something new to the marketplace that is going to have an impact on the way that patients deliver care either to themselves or care is just delivered differently in general. Tell us a little bit about some of the methodologies that your team has used in order to feel confident that what you were bringing to market was aligned with stakeholder expectations and their needs.
Yeah, for sure. I think the biggest thing in the way that we think about it, my team does, is that we're building a future that doesn't exist in a lot of these situations, right? And so when you're building a future that doesn't exist, simply asking questions for what people want, they're going to give you an answer because you're asking a question. But oftentimes, I would say the majority of the time, what people say they want or what they do is not accurate for what they actually do in real life. So fundamentally, the way that we start and the way that I've always done it is I'm less concerned around, well, I should say, if we're looking at a particular disease state, we really just want to understand what happens. So somebody, in our case, if I'm thinking about depression, I want to just understand broadly to begin with, what does a good day look like? What does a bad day look like? What does everything else look like in between? I'm not worried so much about an individual product that we may have or a target product profile that we may have or anything like that. I broadly just want to understand based off of our target population, what does it look like to live with a certain condition day in and day out, right? So fundamentally, number one, what's good, what's bad, what are some of the challenges that currently exist? Because what that then enables us to do, and the exercise that we always do, is then saying, okay, looking at this population, what jobs do these people have, right? Meaning, what are they trying to solve in their day? Whether it is functional things that they have, whether it is emotional things, whether it is societal things, like there's all sorts of different things when you adopt a product, when you look for something new, you're trying to solve for. So we always want to start there very broadly. And then from there also understand, well, why are those things not happening currently? What are the constraints in the system with that individual? Is it physical? Is it cognitive? Is it healthcare? Is it whatever it could be? What are the things that are impeding them right now? And then beginning to understand, like, what is that minimum threshold, right? We'll call it an MVP, we'll call it whatever, but what could we potentially deliver to an individual that is going to allow them to say, yep, this is it. I will now adopt your product. It may not be perfect, and it won't be perfect. But what is that minimum thing that's actually going to make an impact on an individual for them to begin to adopt it? And really the way that we do that is through constant iteration, right? So as I always like to say, we got to get outside the four walls of our organization and actually sit down with people, understand, observe, shadow, all these sorts of things. Once you do that, you can then take these ideas back, once you have your insights, begin to then actually co-create together, right, with the people that are potentially going to be taking your product, with the people that are potentially going to be prescribing your product, or just frankly using it. And that really helps us kind of dimensionalize down these higher level ideas of what we're solving and the constraints, and then get back into real specifics around areas that we can then solve for and design against.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, this is an area we, Veranex, we spend the overwhelming majority of our time, right? I'd say that we're darn near world class at going in and really helping uncover what those unmet needs are and where that opportunity areas exist. And you've been, riding shotgun with us on many of those programs and the work that we've done together. I guess a question that I would ask, and some of the feedback and some of the questions we're starting to get now, is just around that level of qualitative research, right? So we're looking at usually 5 to 8 individuals per unique stakeholder group that we're going to go in and do this discovery work with, right? And if the caregiver is heavily involved in providing, care to the patient, we want to get their input. If it's the patient who we're really looking to understand, obviously we want their input. But you brought it up earlier too, this notion of understanding diverse perspectives and looking at people with different socioeconomic statuses or people who come from different walks of life. When you're only working within a distribution of 5 to 8 individuals on a program like that, some of our clients are starting to ask us, like, how are we making sure that we're getting diverse representation, right? And it's you can start to blow up those research programs really fast if you're adding other stakeholder groups. And so I guess what are your thoughts on that? Like, are you still really leaning heavily into, qualitative research and for your teams, like, how are you thinking about that kind of study design of some of that?
Yeah, it still has to be qualitative upfront. There's frankly no other way around it. And I think it's It's interesting, right? I think a lot of the pushback that you're getting is because a lot more pharma companies, right, are so used to the big ends, quantitative everything, that as people are trying to start to adopt some of these new human-centered designs, it's totally foreign to them to start with these small sample sizes, right? And I think the other part that throws people is they treat studies as being discrete individual studies, where when I look at them, it may be 5 to 8 people in this round, but then when you start multiplying that over 6, 7, 8 different rounds of research, your ends start ballooning, right? And then you combine that with quantitative work that you're going to do later, and that's where, when you look at a program holistically in the idea of iteration, that's when you actually get it right. And so the ways that we would always do it is we're always going to validate everything that we're doing, right? So you're always going to start off with your qualitative and really just frankly understand who people are. From there, you can take different sets of people then to actually validate those things. So I think it's always best to go in that kind of early co-create with the same groups of people. But then as you start getting into feature set, as you start trying to get into landing different elements that you've showed in your chart around desirability, feasibility, and viability, that's when you start to begin to take feature sets and MVPs and things that you've gotten qualitatively and start to try to quantify those sorts of things with broader bases. Because I think what's always beneficial is you want to start on the edges, meaning you want to get the people that are really leading edge with kind of the really crazy ideas and the people that are super conservative, because as you start doing more of the research, it's going to kind of focus it down into more of something that's more scalable for, frankly, for more of a general population. And so it really is just a combination, but it's got to be done in an iterative manner where your qualitative number actually balloons up as you do it more and more and more. Yeah. That's the way, and the example that I've always given my team is the movie Groundhog Day, where, you know, there's the scene where Bill Murray works in the bar and, like, as Andy McDowell, whoever's sitting at the bar, and, like, the first time he's trying to talk to her, I think he walks in and gets the drink order wrong and the conversation shuts down, right? Next day he comes in and gets the drink order right and the toast wrong and it shuts down. Third time he gets the drink order, the toast, and whatever down, and then they fall in love, and whatever happens in the movie, I forget. But that's sort of our approach. I know it's kind of a silly example, but it is that Groundhog Day approach of continuing just to iterate through different samples. And that's really what we actually get to somewhere.
Yeah, so I'm gonna ask you a follow-up, and it's kind of a two-pronged question. Because I know you're a big believer in qualitative before quantitative and the aggregate of the two together to drive really powerful insights. I'm sure there was a point in time where you learned the value, like you really truly saw the value for the first time of qualitative research. I would love for you to share that story. And then to kind of bolt on to that too, I'm sure that there are a lot of people in the audience here too that also see the value of qualitative research and its need, but have a hard time selling that to leadership because either they've never experienced it themselves or they grew up in a culture inside an organization that was very quantitatively driven. And so, you know, I'd ask that perhaps, and I know again, two-pronged question, maybe you provide some advice to folks in the audience who really do believe in this, but are having a hard time figuring out how to communicate that to leadership, how to go to their boss or their boss's boss and really have a conversation about the importance of this. And so, yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, I mean, so the thing that really set it off for me was a while ago, and this was actually work that I think we had done together in Huntington's disease. This was a long, long time ago, but there are certain things you can read about things, right? You can read about a condition, you can read about impact on people, but until you actually see it firsthand, until you hear a story, until you can shake somebody's hand, until you can really bring it to life, the actual impact and the challenges that somebody is facing, you don't know what it is, right? There's a reason why when you look at anything that we do as a society, there can be articles, there can be conversations about things that are happening, but until there's a video, until there's a picture, people pay attention. And why is that? Because they resonate with it, right? It hits you, you understand, you finally can see it, feel it, and touch it. And that's the benefit of qualitative, right? We talk about quality of life, talk about activities of daily living. We talk about all the same stuff that we want to try to solve for. But until you can hear those words from somebody and see what that actually looks like, you can't really get people behind the mission. And so to me, the biggest thing how to sell people is exactly that, is this idea that the reason we need to do this is because kind of twofold. One, we're trying to build something that does not currently exist. So that's number one. And when you do that, you need to start with the individuals. Number two, the other part of it is it's not so much just the qualitative research as it is selling them on this idea of human-centered design, selling them on the idea of design thinking, right? These ideas and how you actually do that is what the sell is. It's then just when you get into that level, it's the individual steps that go into it, right? So you're not just selling qualitative research. You're selling the whole package of, well, what we're going to be doing is we're starting with qualitative, right? We're then taking these insights. We're going to then take those, synthesize it down into insights. We're going to bring those back into co-create sessions where we're going to sit down with individuals. We're going to sit down with healthcare providers, caregivers, whoever. We're then going to synthesize people from the organization, and that's the other big part. Where the actual sell happens is when you do these sessions and you bring in senior leaders and you're sitting down together and you feel like the power of that is when people start getting on board. And so when you sell the entire program as to what steps go into it, that's really where it happens. At least from my experience, that's what it's been. And it has to be some of it where you're just going to lead with some of the individual parts, but you got to get to the co-create part because that's when really the magic happens with people being on board with the process.
Yeah, because you bring them into it, right? And once they're brought into it and they see it firsthand, it's hard to ignore what you're seeing and what you're hearing. So no, I think that's super insightful. I do want to touch just briefly on the quantitative side of things because I do think that there's of course, human-centered design is very focused on the qualitative research, but I do think that there's value in a time and a place to stack things up from a quantitative perspective. Like, where has that worked well for you in your professional experience?
Yeah, I think once you start getting into like capabilities, feature sets, things like that, and you really want to understand what those things begin to look like, that's where quantitative is really going to help you because your qual is going to get you up to that point, right? You're going to figure out some elements of design. You're going to figure out some other areas like that. But then when you start getting into like decision making around ranking of feature sets and different things along those lines, that's where we've had a lot of success in the past with doing things around quantitative to understand those sorts of things.
Yeah.
So that's where I think you really bring it in.
Okay. And then
but that's only after you have actually let people tell you what it should be, right?
That's right. Yeah, I mean, you're quantitatively validating not your own assumptions, but real feedback, right? And I think that's where people get lost with quantitative research often is they make some assumptions about the feature sets that patients would prefer. They do their own qualitative research, and then they go, oh, like this is what we expected, right? And they end up driving that to market, and then you have some real mismatched expectations. Help me in the audience understand, once your team has really grabbed that bolus of information, I know your team's responsible for that. How much further do you guys take the process, right? Because the research is just the start, right? Then there's the design and the development of that. Like what is your team responsible for, and at what point do you guys hand off?
Yeah, I don't think there is a handoff. So, you bring it forward, we're looking at it from ideation into implementation and then into lifecycle management. So, the whole idea is once you figure out what your product is going to be, you then need to actually get your product out there, right? So then what our team does is we take a philosophy, and I think everybody should, of a buy, borrow, build approach, right? So a lot of what you want to do within digital health, the tech probably exists out there, right? If we're being honest, to a certain degree. And so I think it's a matter of saying then within that tech, what's the next, or within what you're solving and within your consideration set, what's your next step? Are you building from scratch if you need something that's totally novel and new? Are you partnering with somebody who may have, 50, 60% of it right, but you're then customizing that other 50, 60% or 40% for what you need? Or you're simply borrowing something that's off the shelf, right? That's sort of the next step. But then from there, it's then validating, even once you have your technology, the next elements of it, which start to get into usability. They start to get into some of the different elements that you then need to work through. And then it's also deployment strategies, right? So it's one thing for you to actually know what you're going to build or have something to build, but then it's understanding the user acceptance of it, and then subsequently, how is this thing actually going to be put out there? There's a lot of different strategies that you need to consider, but the UX testing and the usability is such a big thing. So because of that, right, we know data is, at the end of the day, it's not about the piece of plastic or the sensor or the whatever, it's about the data. It's about taking that data, spinning it into, and it's going to be disparate data streams, taking that data and spinning it into actionable information, which is then embedded into a workflow for treatment, back to a patient, to a life sciences company, to patient services, wherever it's going to go based off of your use case. But if the usability is not right, to your point of acceptance earlier, if people are not actually accepting of your device, if you're creating multiple steps, if you're creating friction in the process, you're not going to collect any data, and then therefore you're done at that point, right? So it's, again, getting back into that iterative phases. Once you've landed on what your product is, it's still iteration to go through the usability, and then you're getting into your deployment scenario. So like, it's always hard to do because I'm not a designer, but like, we all treat it straight line within PowerPoint, but like the whole thing is just squiggly circles throughout each one of these steps as you're going through, because it's 2 steps forward, it's 3 back. Like it's never linear progress when you do this stuff right.
Yeah. Yeah, let's talk just a little bit about this whole notion of like novel and like completely ground up new versus like an off the shelf, right? I mean, there's got to be some benefits and trade-offs. Like when we talk about usability and making sure you get it right, the idea of developing something novel with really foundational research is like, that sounds great. It sounds great to me, but time to market is of concern and cost is probably of concern, right? But then you look across the road at, off the shelf or maybe somewhere in between, and you're thinking time to market's maybe better, cost is maybe better, but are we sacrificing usability, right? And certain elements of customization, like in your experiences, how have you gone about that decision making of like what's best for this particular product?
Yeah, at the end of the day, it comes down to usability and data in that regard. So what I mean by that is you may have, again, a lot of the tech is commoditized for some of the stuff that you want to do. So you may have a device, a solution, a company out there, but if the experience isn't what your population needs, meaning you may have a population that has cognitive constraints, physical constraints, all sorts of different things, it's not going to work for you. So then it's a conversation and it's a discussion around, from a partner perspective, is this company as a partner willing to customize for what we need specifically or not, right? That's an easy decision, or it's one that you can make the call on. If they're not, then that's when you start getting into the conversation of saying, okay, we now need to go a different route into something that is more of a build. And again, really at the end of the day, with the other part that's going to be the consideration is, odds are a lot of these situations, the value is not in the device. The value is in the data, or the value is in the algorithm that you are then subsequently getting from your device, right? So you can do that through multiple different ways, but you can't do it without the data, first and foremost. And I always say that, data into actionable information. So to me, it's all around what is the optimal way to collect the data. And if that is through a partner that's willing to customize and get it specifically to your needs, if you're talking with constraints of that population, awesome. If you can't do that, then I would argue your benefit is going to be actually building, because the time to market and getting something out there is one thing, but the majority of the time you're going to have to do some work up front to validate, and that can mean many different things. It can be like big V validation, or just understanding correlations to existing standards and scales of what you're getting from a data perspective. So there's going to be a lead time regardless.
Yeah. So I mean, if I'm somebody who's trying to make this decision, I think there's a lot of benefit. If I go and I do this level of research, I collect the qualitative research, I collect the quantitative research, I have a good idea for what the feature set needs to be and whom it's for. And there's a partner out there that can adequately match up to those needs and collect the data. Everything that's like ideal scenario, right? I mean, it's got good usability, it's aligned with user needs, they can collect the data, speed to market is great. But when there's a mismatch and there's perhaps not a partner in the market that can do that, that's when you really need to start thinking about innovation and novel.
Yeah,
cool.
And I think another good way to do that, so we've talked a lot about just doing qualitative research. I think the other part where we've had a ton of success too is start looking at the market, right? So if you start looking at heuristics of, well, I mean, that's a little further down the road, but just start with an assessment, right? What's out there in the areas of interest? And then you start looking through from a heuristics, from a design perspective, like what do we need to measure ourselves up against? That's a good way to do it. And I know, Brandon, with your team at Veronix, we've done a lot of that work as well, and that's always been really successful as you start to get into kind of combining that work with the qualitative upfront to kind of give you that complete picture.
Yeah. And I think there's this notion too, right? Like when you work with a development, like when you work with a firm like us, for example, I think the expectation would be is, they help you with the research work and then they want the design work too. But we've actually found ourselves more and more frequently, especially in the drug delivery space, we have clients who come to us and they say, hey, like we believe that off the shelf is the way that we want to do this. Help us navigate that because we've never navigated it before. So help us identify the partners in the marketplace that we should be having conversations with. How do we navigate what level of customization we can play with? Can we change the IFU? Can we change the packaging? Like those are, if you've never done that before, that can be a somewhat daunting task, right? And I think we've done a nice job, helping our clients navigate those decisions. So we'll move on. We got a couple more questions, and I know we're coming up, and we got about 10 minutes. Guys, if you have questions in the audience, please feel free to use the chat function. Send them along to Greg and I. We'll do our best to get those answered here and leave just a little bit of time at the end. But we talked a little bit about AI, right? And I think it's a big question. I think it's in the early stages, but I do think it's worth getting your thoughts on, the role that you see AI playing in the coming years within our industry, within the pharma space, with respect to digitally facing tools. If you had to put a bet out there on the most impactful use cases, what are some of the things that you and your team are thinking about?
Yeah, I think it makes perfect sense, right? So let's think about pharma and life sciences companies. We are sitting on tons of data and we don't really know what to do with it or how to kind of bring it together, but we know there's something there. So there's kind of two ways that we can look at it. There's sort of like the fishing expeditions where we're like, we've got all this data, let's see what we can do. And then there's more of sort of the focused use cases around how we can leverage this data. And so to me, there's a couple. Like I think the ones that are most front and center right now are when you start looking at drug discovery. So taking that existing data and understanding what you're doing from a drug discovery perspective. I mean, that's like the low-hanging fruit. That's what you're seeing a lot of companies going after now. I think, and I'm just kind of in my mind walking through sort of like the process. So that's one area there. When you think about clinical research, start thinking about how you can do data-driven everything, meaning data-driven site selection and protocol development, and everything else is another huge area when you think about existing data. The part that I would say, I think those are kind of the standard ones that you think about, the stuff that gets me most excited is when I think about, and I'll keep it broad because I don't want to say it's a medical device or not, but when I start thinking about clinical decision support. So that whole idea of when you do have somebody taking a product and you want to begin to understand disease progression, you want to begin to understand effectiveness of your drug, you want to begin to understand different elements like that, that's where, because we don't really carve it out as AI, but as I said, like the only way that you go from collecting disparate data streams from a sensor, from a wearable, from a phone, from a whatever, and getting that back into something actionable is essentially, call it AI, call it whatever you want, right? But that's actually what you're doing. And so that whole idea is critical because where all these things fall down is that without that, you're not adequately optimizing care. So what I mean by that is we've all had doctor's appointments. We all have the first couple minutes where the doctor's head down, typing into an EHR, they're doing whatever they're doing, right? And usually, I don't know about you guys, my response, whether I walk in and my foot is hanging off or I feel great, is like, how are you doing? I'm like, I'm all right, right? That's my response. That's what someone's working with. So the idea of having AI be able to support clinical decision making and being integrated into a workflow comes down to being able to take just a bunch of data and turning it into something that somebody can easily understand, that's going to be clinically meaningful and help actually optimize care. Optimize that patient-HCP relationship is really what it's about for me. And that is the ultimate use case. But again, if you look at all of your cool products, your shiny objects that have failed, it's because that element's missing. They haven't been able to move into, what that next step is, right? We all thought Fitbits were amazing, and that's not, just as a health and wellness example. But then we all quickly were like, what does 7,000 steps mean? What does 12,000 steps mean? Because it's not actionable. And that's where kind of and again, there's a lot of healthcare applications that we've seen like that as well. And so to me, that's the area.
Yeah. The term that comes to mind for me with AI and healthcare is to empower and not replace, right? And so in the situation that you gave, let's empower our HCPs to have information at their hands that allows them to provide a better patient experience. Because I think there's this fear of AI is going to take jobs. And I think that there's, I think in certain industries, I think there's a real, needs to be a conversation about that, certainly. But within healthcare, I think there's this notion of our nurses and our doctors are already taxed. We're limited as far as hiring. They're working crazy hours. And so if we can play a role in helping empower, not replace, I think that we can give them that, that third hand, if you will, to be able to make better decisions.
Yeah, and that's, just broadly speaking from a Sage perspective, right? We're a brain health company. You start looking at depression, we understand the limitations in terms of resources that are out there for folks. We understand, as I said earlier, the limitations in biomarkers and being able to identify people objectively who have things that we care about, right? Things like depression, things like postpartum depression, they're real challenges. And so again, simply from a Sage perspective, that's areas we're really excited about.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, so I'll go into the last question here, and then I think we do have a few from the audience that we'll want to get to. And this one is around, for those folks who are maybe earlier in their career and they've been tasked with building out a digital health team. We're thinking about resourcing, we're thinking about partners, everything that goes through your head, and I'm sure this happened to you too when you were building out your first team. You got to think about those things, right? And so I think, what advice would you have for an individual building on a team? Which resources would you bring onto the team first, and why? How do you pick those first couple folks, and what are their backgrounds? Who's the foundation of this group today?
Yeah, it really varies. I can tell you my team right now is amazing, and they all have really diverse backgrounds in terms of where they've come from, but there's always something similar, and that is the idea of, number one, it's going to sound weird, but understanding the business, right? Oftentimes, there's a lot of people that work in pharma and life sciences companies that really don't understand what the company does or how processes work. They understand their little silo, but they don't understand the overall business and the external environment. Number two, it's that orientation of simply being able to say, what are we solving? And being able to bring that to life in an organization. So the technical side of understanding tech or development or digital or things like that, to me, is actually secondary. If you can't land on problem solving, if you can't understand the whole idea of empathy within patient populations and how to connect and how to actually bring those things to life, none of the other stuff matters. And so oftentimes people that have done consulting work, people that have backgrounds like that are usually really good at that, because you're starting with a problem and then you're then diving deeper into solutions. Where I think people get tripped up are two things. One, when you build digital health companies, organizations that are siloed, right? When they're not integrated into overall operating models for the company, that's when they become sort of academic, scientific experiment, like we're just going to do stuff for the sake of doing it and maybe put some papers out about it, right? Like they're not really having an impact on the business. And so I would definitely shy away from that. I would also, again, you can leverage, there's companies out there, right? There's companies like Veranex that can help with the research, the usability, the design, those different elements of it. But the strategy and that sort of core group that you can embed within your organization, those are the people that you really need to have, I think, from the jump.
Yeah. No, I think that's what we're seeing broadly across a lot of the organizations that we work with, right? And we talked about this in another webinar, is like having the core expertise and strategy in-house and being able to, at least with a small group, guide some of that decision making and then look outside, whether that be with an independent consultant that you bring on for a period of time or a group to kind of fill in some of the gaps that you have on a project by project basis. And as long as you can maintain that core team and that core vision, and there's at least a working know-how around the digital space, that seems to work really, really well for our customers. So, well, Greg, with that, I think what we'll do is turn it over to Ryan. I think we do have a couple audience questions. We could take a little bit of time to get those answered now.
Yes, thank you very much for that very insightful discussion. I'm sure our audiences appreciate it. I would like to invite the audience to keep sending some questions or comments right now using the questions window for this Q&A portion of our webinar. Now, I've already received some questions, so let's get started with those. The very first question here is wondering what is being done to help patients use these CGM to pay for the topical device to use the free app to help them not have to stick themselves. The manufacturers of these devices do not share all the data with each other.
Yeah, that's a good question. So I can tell you it's been a good number of years since I've been within the diabetes space. As I said, Sage right now, we're very much focused within depression. So I think that's one we can probably do a little bit of research around, right, Brandon, and kind of come back with what we're seeing specifically. It's probably a great question for Veranex from from that CGM space and what they're doing in there. But yeah, that's a little bit straying from where I've been in the last couple of years, but it's a fantastic question, and I think that just kind of lends to the whole idea of accessibility of data and sharing, and frankly, overall, just general accessibility when you think about some of the challenges that you have within digital health, within patient empowerment, and things like that as well. So I think it's a great question.
Yeah, I'd echo that. I think that there are certainly some folks inside of Veranex that can help with some of that. So we'll get back to you in short order.
That's wonderful. And I guess looking at the time now, I realize we have reached the end of the Q&A portion of our webinar. If we couldn't get to all your questions, know that the team at Veranex will follow up with you. I want to thank everyone for participating in today's webinar. You will be receiving a follow-up email from X-Talks with access to the recorded archive for this event. A survey window will be popping up on your screen as you exit, and your participation is appreciated as it will help us to improve our webinars. Now, I've also sent you a link in the chat box, and with this link, you'll be able to view the recording of this event on this page, and you can also share this link with your colleagues when they register for the recording here as well. So I encourage you to do that. Now, please join me once more in thanking our speakers for their wonderful time here today. We hope everyone found the webinar informative. Have a great day, everyone, and thank you for coming.
Thank you all. Have a great day. Thanks, Greg.
Yeah, thanks, guys. Take care.